Okay, so for the past 3 weeks, the other weeks that we've met regarding how to orient yourself to the book of Revelation, I've kind of been presenting literary features of the Revelation and reasons from a literary point of view that you would want to maybe understand it as being written about what's going to happen soon and near to the original audience. So first century events. And so that's a preterist viewpoint. And it's obviously it's the case that not everybody takes a preterist viewpoint of the book of Revelation. You have futurists, which is the most popular, most I don't know, popular is the right way to say it, but it's the most well known among people in the Western world in this time period. And so, eventually in the next week or two, we'll talk about why do people not, why isn't everybody a preterist, and why are there people who think we should interpret the book of Revelation in a different way, and what are their reasons for that? And so, I'd like to present those fairly and honestly to you so that you can see how people arrive at different conclusions. But right now, I'm still kind of working through some of the main reasons why I think we should interpret the book of Revelation from a preterist perspective. And what preterist means, again, refers to in the past. And so what we're saying is that for the most part, the visions in the book of Revelation on a preterist view have been fulfilled in the past. And when we say that, generally what we're saying is that they were fulfilled in the first century. So there's still other events out in our future, the final second coming of Christ, the general resurrection, the judgment, the new heavens and new earth, the casting of Satan into hell. Those things are still in our future. But for the most part, on a preterist interpretation, we look at the book of Revelation and we say, these things happened in the first century. And those are usually linked with the fall of Jerusalem in 70 AD and the events surrounding that. So we talked about, in the first couple of weeks, we talked about genre, talked about, what is the literary form of the book of Revelation and how does that help us approach it? And we saw it's a letter, the entire book, and that had implications for what it might mean and how it would be relevant to the first century audience. It's also a prophecy, which the first century audience is told to keep, meaning that they could understand it. So that rules out some more fanciful interpretations. And then it's an apocalyptic book, which means that the message is conveyed for the most part in symbols, in visions, which are made up of symbolic pictures. And we talked about how do we know how to interpret these pictures, and the answer to that was they're either interpreted for you in the immediate context, or the pictures are coming from earlier parts of the Bible and they're interpreted there. And then we asked, what about uninterpreted parts? Well, uninterpreted parts are just meant to be filler to help you get the picture. They don't have actual discrete meaning that you would need to discern. And then last week we talked about the Olivet Discourse, Jesus's speech, his discourse, teaching about the end of the age and the coming destruction on the temple. And we went through that, and I showed how the things that are usually pointed out as having not been fulfilled yet can be seen to have been fulfilled if you compare scripture to scripture. And again, whether that is the correct procedure or not is a question that everybody has to decide for themselves. Just because I can link passages together doesn't mean I'm linking them together correctly. That's up to you to look at that. And of course, if you have any question about anything that I'm doing, please bring it up, and I'll hopefully be able to explain it. And if not, I'll hopefully be humble enough to say, that might be a problem for my view. Maybe I should think about that. So today I want to talk about a couple of literary features that kind of link together Revelation 1 and Revelation 22. So the first and last chapter of the book. And these literary features that link these two chapters kind of serve as brackets or bookends. that kind of encompass the entire book of Revelations. They're bracketing the entire content between chapters 1 and 22. And then there are also links between chapters 1 and 22 and Daniel 2. And that would be Nebuchadnezzar's dream of the statue with made out of 4 metals, and the stone coming in and hitting the feet of the statue falling, and the stone growing into the kingdom of God. And so the literary features are not just there for our interest, just to go, oh, wow, that's interesting, look at that. But there's some significance that's attached to these. And so I want to look at 3 of the literary features that are within these things. The first one is called intertextuality, and that's kind of a general, broad statement about all kinds of literary features that fall into this intertextuality type of thing. And then I'll define that in a minute. I also want to talk about inclusions, also called inclusios. This is a really hard thing to look up these days if you're trying to figure out what is an inclusion, because what you get back is we should include all kinds of people. You get diversity. And, so it's very hard to actually look this up on the internet unless you also include literary term in your search. So just as
probably learn the value of the minus sign in Google search.
That's right. Not diversity.
Yeah.
Right. So, and then the last one is illusion. I think we're familiar mostly with illusion, but maybe not with inclusion and intertextuality. So on the second page of the outline, I have intertextuality at the top there. We're just going to define what these various things mean. And a good definition of this is that intertextuality is the embedding of fragments of an earlier text within a later one. And so that means anytime you read in the Bible or in some other text, a quotation or an allusion or an echo, some kind of reference that is of a literary feature, without saying I'm referring to this passage, but by just using the words, that's called a text fragment that has been taken from the older text and then reused, embedded in the newer text. And so there's an example on the page there with John 1:1 and Genesis 1:1. We're both familiar with that. You can see on the page that they're linked with, in the beginning, God. They're both linked with that. And so there are 2 fragments from Genesis 1:1, in the beginning, and God, that are brought back into John 1:1. And what happens what this signifies is, again, more than just, oh, that's neat, these things are being repeated, but the understanding from Genesis 1:1 helps us to put John 1:1 into kind of an interpretive framework, right? We go, okay, so Genesis 1:1 is talking about creation. God is creating all things. He's the creator. And John 1:1 then is talking about not creation, but it's going to be new creation. So you have the creation idea again coming up, and this is the new creation comes to us through the Word, who is God and who is with God, whereas the creation comes to us through God or from God. So how the text fragments from a previous text function is they alert the reader that the later text is to be interpreted in light of the earlier text, right? That makes sense. And so the earlier text contributes meaning or a framework or both to the later text. And the thing I want to point out in the next paragraph is that this is, it goes both directions. Not only do we get things from Genesis 1 going to John 1, talking about creation, that's an idea lifted from Genesis 1, and then it's associated with John 1 through that textual fragment. So we have this idea of creation. But also, since these 2 texts are now linked, we are able to legitimately say that the Word we're first of all, legitimately, we can say that the Word is God and is not the person of God, so that there's a multiplicity, a plurality of persons in the Godhead. We see that from John 1:1. And we also see that Word is God. And so those ideas can legitimately then be brought back into Genesis when we read Genesis 1:1, because when you link the text, the information goes both ways. So does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's the broad idea of intertextuality. And when we're talking about inclusions and allusions, they both fall under the umbrella of intertextuality because they're linked by specific words or ideas that are being lifted from one text, one context, and being reused in another one. So we'll move on to inclusion, sometimes called inclusio. In fact, I learned it as inclusio, but when I read the literature these days, they call it inclusion. I don't know why. Maybe inclusio is singular and inclusion is plural. I really don't know. But an inclusio refers to a repetition that makes the beginning, or that marks the beginning and the end of a section. So a repetition, and it marks the beginning and end of a section. So it brackets, or it puts that section in an envelope as marked off material. And another way to explain it here is in the quotation, and inclusio is a literary device where the writer states the theme or idea at both the beginning and at the end of a story. It's intended to introduce and conclude a main point. Everything in between is to be read within the inclusio theme in mind, or with the inclusio theme in mind. When you think of inclusio, think bookends. So I think that's an easy concept, right? Something's introduced, something then at the end is restated. And then you're supposed to understand that the stuff in the middle has something to do with the things at both ends, that the brackets are actually informing how to read the stuff in the middle. But one example from not the Bible, but everybody's done this, all of us, each of us have done this. We sent out resumes with cover letters, right? And when you write a cover letter, you introduce yourself in the first line. Well, there's different formats, but basically you introduce yourself, you say what job you're applying for, you give your qualifications and some specific reasons why you think you might be a good choice. And so first paragraph is introducing yourself, second paragraph is kind of an expansion on your qualifications, and then the last paragraph you back out of it and you say, so to sum up, and then you give one sentence summary of why you think you're qualified, and you name the name of the position that you're applying for, and you say, I hope to hear from you about this soon, or look forward to, and then you sign your name, and so you back out, and so you have an inclusio, a couple of them, right? Letter starts with your name, ends with your name, refers to in the next paragraph or the next line about the job you're applying for, that's referred to again at the very end. And you kind of have this bracketing thing going on, and the brackets tell you why the stuff in the center is significant, because it has to do with you and your qualifications and your desire to. Anyway, simple. I don't need to overtalk it. That's what an inclusion is. So there's an example here from Matthew 1:18 and also 22:23 compared to Matthew 28. You can see the highlighted portion in Matthew 1:18 or Matthew 22 and 23. The virgin will be with child and will give birth to a son, and they will call him Emmanuel, which means God with us. So God with us is highlighted there. In the end of Matthew, in chapter 28, almost the very last verse, actually it is the last verse, Jesus says, and surely I am with you always. So it's the gospel starts with the identification of Jesus as God with us, and ends with Jesus saying, I am with you. And so you have this idea that is linked at the beginning and the end. And so you would say, well, this is a theme of the Gospel of Matthew. And Ted Weiss explains it this way: God is present with us in the person of Jesus Christ. And he says that's a theme of Matthew. And you can see that based just on the literary clue that you have from the inclusio. So that's how you would kind of use an inclusio. You would try to notice them. And of course, in a document like Matthew that has 28 chapters, it's not really easy to notice those things. You have to reread the document many times, and then you go, wait a second, I see a connection here. I think actually we start to see the connection after we finish Matthew and then restart it, and we go, hey, wait a sec, I just finished Matthew and it said God is with us. And now I'm starting Matthew and it says God is with us. Wow. So there you go. So that's an inclusion. The reason I'm talking about these things is because we're going to see examples in just a minute. And so allusion is a form of repeating somebody's words from an earlier text. It's not quite a quotation. Quotation uses specific words in a specific order, but allusion might use one word or a couple of words, or maybe the general idea, not even the same words. So they're a little more sneaky, a little harder to see. But the writer, expects that the intended reader or hearers will recognize the allusion and will be familiar with the text that is being evoked there or referred to. So in the quote there, an allusion functions to suggest to the reader that text B, that is the later text, should be interpreted or understood in light of a broad interplay with text A, encompassing aspects of A beyond those explicitly echoed. So I'll give you an example of an allusion, or actually a quotation that is functioning as an allusion. So Jesus on the cross says, my God, why have you forsaken me? And we've been taught that we're supposed to link that with Psalm 22, where it starts off, my God, why have you forsaken me? And the way that it functions when Jesus says it is to link Jesus's not only words, but his experience to Psalm 22, but not just to Psalm 22 in the section that's being quoted, but to the entirety of Psalm 22. And so that's what it means when it says that it encompasses aspects of the original text beyond those explicitly echoed. So what happens then is that to understand better what Jesus is going through and the significance of his cry of dereliction, you would go to Psalm 22, read the whole psalm. And then that entire context informs how you're to understand that section where Jesus is crying out, my God, why have you forsaken me? So allusions are like that. They bring in more than just the words being used. They're going to bring in, and that's the same with a lot of intertextuality. It's going to bring in not just the words, but the concepts that are associated with those words in the broader context. And so what's assumed is that the reader is familiar with the original context. And what that means for us is that if we're not familiar with the original context, we need to go read it. So we become familiar with it. So the next section of the outline, I have tables. And I want to show, in the first table, I want to show inclusions in Revelation 1. And the way this works is the passage on the left side, as you look at it, is the inclusion from that passage is in the passage on the left. So for instance, Revelation 1 verses 1 and 2 are linked by an inclusion to Revelation 22:6. And I have those inclusions highlighted. So just to read Revelation 1 and 2, the revelation of Jesus Christ, which God gave him to show to his servants the things that must soon take place. He made it known by sending his angel to his servant John, who bore witness to the word of God and to the testimony of Jesus Christ, even to all that he saw. Revelation 22:6, and he said to me, these words are trustworthy and true. And the Lord, the God of the spirits of the prophets, has sent his angel to show his servants what must soon take place. So obviously, show his servants what must soon take place is almost a direct quote from the first chapter. And we have the reference to the angel who is showing. And then, of course, show is linked with saw in first chapter one there. And so you have this inclusion, which is just to say you have a repetition, something from chapter 1 now showing up in chapter 22. And that would be significant by itself, but there are actually 3 inclusions that link chapter 1 and chapter 22, kind of making it, in my way of understanding, my way of thinking, making it obviously apparent that these are inclusions and not just some random chance thing that happens because of words. So the second one is in verse 3 of chapter 1. Blessed is the one who reads aloud the words of this prophecy, and blessed are those who hear and who keep what is written in it, for the time is near. 22:7, behold, I am coming soon. Blessed is the one who keeps the words of the prophecy of this book. Okay, so blessed is the one who keeps the words of this prophecy is repeated. And you can see that they're kind of not, the whole phrase isn't, brought over exactly the same, but you can see clearly that Revelation 22:7 is repeating the idea and some of the words in the exact order from Revelation 1:3. So you have an inclusion here. And then again, Revelation 1:3, which we just read, is brought up again in Revelation 22:10. And he said to me, do not seal up the words of this prophecy. So that's repeated from 1:3 of this book, for the time is near. For the time is near is also brought in from Revelation 1:3. So you have this, you have these 3 inclusios that are linking these 2 chapters in the Revelation. And so the thought, or at least the way I understand it, I guess I'll say it like this. I don't know if there's different ways to understand this inclusio. The only way that I'm aware of to understand it is what I'm going to say next, which is these things showing up in chapter 1 and then showing up in 22. These are acting as brackets for the entirety of the Revelation. And when you take these 3 sets of brackets together, what you end up with is the entirety of Revelation is written for those people in the first century to whom it was delivered, so that they would be able to keep those words because the time was near. And that the way that they got those words is that the Father sent an angel to John, who gave John words to show his servants what must soon take place. So we have this emphasis on time is near twice in these inclusions, right? In the first inclusion, you have these things must soon take place. You see that in both Revelation 1:1 and 2 and 22:6. And then in 1:3 and 22:10, you have the time is near being repeated there. So we have an emphasis on timing, audience, and their ability to understand. And I think that those inclusions indicate, or strongly indicate, since there's 3 of them, that we should maybe take seriously the people in the book, the people who receive the book, who are being addressed by these inclusios, would be able to understand what was in the book, and that it was something that they were to respond to appropriately. So then I have a section there where I list out 6 things that the inclusions emphasize. We can look at those. You can look at those on your own there. I mentioned some of them. Now we get to allusions to Daniel 2. This is really interesting. So the first thing I want to say is I have a highlighted Greek phrase there. It's highlighted in blue. It's actually a word, and that word is apocalypse in Revelation, and apocalypton, which is coming from the same word in the Septuagint translation, so the Greek translation of the Old Testament of Daniel. So that's interesting. Daniel 2:27-29. Daniel answered the king and said, no wise man, enchanters, magicians, or astrologers can show to the king the mystery that the king has asked, but there is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries, and he has made known to King Nebuchadnezzar what will be in the latter days. Your dream and the visions of your head as you lay in your bed are these. To you, O king, as you lay in bed, came thoughts of what would be after this? And he who reveals mysteries made known to you what is to be. Because we have a time element, there's a king, a God in heaven who reveals mysteries about something that's going to be after this, or something that's going to be, time element type of thing going on. Revelation 1, again, the revelation, using that same word from the Septuagint translation of Daniel, the revelation of Jesus Christ, which God gave him to show to his servants the things that must soon take place. He made it known by sending his angel to his servant John, who bore witness to the word of God and the testimony of Jesus Christ, even to all that he saw. So saw links with show. Nobody can show the king what this means, except the God in heaven who reveals mysteries, reveals apocalypse mysteries, and that God has shown Nebuchadnezzar the things that will happen after this, or in the latter days. But John updates that, makes an allusion to it in Revelation 1. It updates it not to things that were going to happen in the latter days, but to things that must soon take place. Right? So but you can see the same pattern of thought, same pattern of words is reappearing in Revelation 1. And you guys do see it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, okay.
Excuse me.
So in Daniel 2:45, the second part of that verse, Daniel repeats again something here. He says, a great God has made known to the king what shall be after this. It sounds like we just read that. I mean, that's a reference back to Daniel 2:27-29, but that's another point. So great God has made known to the king what shall be after this. The dream is certain and its interpretation sure. Revelation 22:6. These words are trustworthy and true. That corresponds to the dream is certain and its interpretation sure. And the Lord, the God of the spirits of the prophets, has sent his angel to show his servants what must soon take place. That corresponds to what shall be after this, that God has made it known. And so what we have here is another allusion to Daniel 2. So Revelation 22:6 alludes back to Daniel 2:45. And in fact, there are two things in that text that are being highlighted. So that's interesting. We'll just keep it in our head right now that there's these allusions going from Daniel to Revelation. And one of the things you want to remember, and you can look up ahead and see it, is that the two passages from Revelation 1:1-2, and Revelation 22:6, are themselves an inclusio, right? Revelation 22:6 is the end of the bracket that started at Revelation 1:1-2, and you could go up to the previous table and see that. So I want to point that out, that the passages that are linking with Daniel here form an inclusio. As it turns out, the passages in Daniel are also an inclusio. And so if you go down to the next section, inclusions in Daniel 2, the passages in Daniel 2, which we just looked at, and which are alluded to in Revelation 1 and 22, are also an inclusio. So you can see that the highlighted parts, I don't need to read it again, but you can see that those things are being repeated in verse 45. They're going back to Daniel 2:27-29 and repeating those things that I've highlighted there. So I'll give you a second to look at that. So you got it? You see that? So in the Daniel 2:27-29, some of the things have been condensed. Yeah, you see it, right? It's like obviously there. So some of the phrases have been condensed in Daniel 2:45. Like for instance, in Daniel 2:29, God is called he who reveals mysteries. But he's also called the God in heaven, up above that in 2:27. But when you get over to Daniel 2:45, this is all condensed to a great God, right? So now we're getting into the really significant stuff. When we consider all this together, and by all this, what I mean is there are allusions and inclusios. So we'll start with the inclusios. There are inclusios between the beginning of Revelation and the end of Revelation. There are also inclusios between the beginning of this section in Daniel. There's one inclusio, and the ending of this section in Daniel. And there are links between all of these passages because of the allusions that are being made. So in the box table where it says allusions and inclusions in Daniel 2, Revelation 1 and 22, you can see how it's laid out there. There's an inclusio between Daniel 2, 27 to 29 and Daniel 2, 45b. There's an inclusio there. Daniel 2, 27 to 29 is alluded to in Revelation 1, 1 through 1 and 2, right? And Daniel 2, 45b is alluded to in Revelation 22, 6. In addition, Revelation 1 through 2 forms an inclusion with Revelation 22, 6. So what you have basically is you have two sets of inclusions. So you've got two brackets. You got a bracket in Daniel, right, that starts in 2:27, and the last bracket's in 2:45. You got a bracket in Daniel, and this bracket is now repeated in Revelation. And it starts in Revelation 1, and it ends in Revelation 22. So you have this bracket that encompasses, what is that, 20 verses or less in Daniel. But in Revelation, it's expanded now, and it's covering 22 chapters. Right?
I see it. The only question I have is, how did you figure this out? I mean,
spent a lot of hours in them. Well, actually, in a lot of commentaries and your cross-referencing, you'll have a lot of references back to these things, and then in some commentaries they'll mention this is an inclusion, or this is an allusion or an echo or something like that. But as far as I know, nobody has put all the pieces together like this. Most of the time they just say this is this, and they don't. But the conclusion that I am drawn to is not. Nobody has a box or even a theoretically, in their thought, they don't see that. They don't see the repetition of two inclusios. But what they do see is they do see the two inclusios. They just don't notice that one is being expanded.
and so what you get from this is God's telling, so what's your lesson from that?
So we'll wait for Mike to come back. But
the
lesson is it's pretty profound, I think, right? I mean, you see it and you go, well, now I've seen it, and now I can't unsee that. It's right there, right? So
it's kind of crazy,
Mike,
actually.
Yeah. So Mike, that's apparent to you that there's two inclusions that are being, like the Daniel inclusion now is being repeated in Revelation. That's the basic thing that we get to. And so the significance of that comes up. What does that even mean? I mean, it's obviously not just a cool literary feature. And so I think what it means is in the very last, or the next kind of graphic where it's got kind of these brackets. So Daniel 2, that section there that's bracketed by the inclusios, that section is about the beginning of the kingdom of God in the time of the Roman Empire. That's how it's interpreted in the dream. And in fact, when we go back and look at Daniel 2, what we see is this section starts with Daniel. Daniel has just previously received the interpretation of the dream from God, and now he's going to talk to Arioch, and then go talk the chief steward, Nebuchadnezzar's steward. And then he's going to go talk to Nebuchadnezzar. And so the section is, he's introducing the idea that there's a God who's revealed this mystery and has told Nebuchadnezzar what's going to happen. And so, and then between that 227 to 29 and 245, he explains the dream. He gives the interpretation. And then at the end, he sums it up again and says, so there is a God in heaven, who's revealed this mystery to you. And so you have this inclusion. So the theme there is about the beginning of the kingdom of God in the time of the Roman Empire. It's the subsequent miraculous growth of that kingdom and its complete triumph over all earthly powers. That's what the interpretation is. And that's what that whole section is the interpretation. And so then you go, okay, so that's the thing that's being bracketed. And now these end brackets are being brought over to Revelation and expanded to include all 22 chapters. And you think, well, I think that there must be a link between the content, right? There must be a link between the content, between the brackets. And so what I say here is that this is my opinion now on the paper there, in light of the literary parallels and the inclusions, it is almost certain that the book of Revelation is an expansion of Daniel 2. And so what I'm saying is that the exact same theme that Daniel 2 is about, this section of Daniel 2 summarizes that's what Revelation is about. And I don't know how to understand it any other way, really. I mean, I can't. I see the allusions, and I see the inclusions, and I see that the Daniel brackets are being brought over to Revelation. And the only way I can understand, there's only two ways to understand it. One is, this is just a weird anomaly that's kind of interesting. And the other way is, this is a significant thing. And how do we normally understand brackets and inclusions and allusions? And so I'm left with the theme of Revelation is about the coming of the kingdom of God during the days of the Roman Empire and its miraculous growth of the kingdom of God and its complete triumph over all earthly powers. I think that kind of sums up what the book of Revelation is about. So that's where the literary thing leads me. And again, there, as we all know, there are different ways that people, good Christians, have understood and do understand the book of Revelation, and not everybody. And in fact, I would probably say that the majority of Christians alive today in America would not agree with the way I just outlined what the theme of Revelation is. And they would have different reasons, and it wouldn't have anything to do with the literary component. It's not like they would say, I see the literary features that you're talking about, and they mean this other thing. They would basically say, either I don't see the literary, it's not important to me. The literary things are not important. They're the most important things are these other things, direct statements and stuff like that. And that's okay.
Is it possible?
Yeah.
Is it possible you can find these same allusion inclusions in other books? In the, I mean, similar. But you have a problem. Am I?
Well, no, I mean, there are inclusions and allusions in other. If you're talking about, are there allusions?
I mean, the specific.
Oh, this one.
In Revelations and Daniel, something like that.
Yeah.
That might lead you to another route.
Yeah, I think that you can. I mean, I think that there are repeated things that come up from, say, Deuteronomy, and they show up. Those same brackets show up somewhere else in later on in God's revelation. And the way that they're always treated when that happens is that they mutually, the former one gives you an interpretive framework for the latter one. It says, this is what it's about in Deuteronomy. And so that emphasis then carries over and informs, it basically qualifies how you can interpret the latter one. So yeah, there are intertextuality
that reflects into Revelations. I'm saying that, like the last chapter.
Yeah. I haven't.
You haven't seen it.
Yeah, I haven't seen it. These ones are these ones are really clear and really prominent. And when you read, I think commentators of all stripes, basically, in the Revelation will recognize some of these. Yeah, I guess I'd say it like this. Not everybody who reads the Revelation and Daniel or the Bible is aware that there are these things. I mean, even potentially,
Mhm.
right? And
I
so they're
wasn't.
not, so they're not looking for them, right? They're not
Yeah.
looking for them, so they don't find them. And then there are people that find them, some of them or all of them, and don't pursue it. They don't ask the next question. Why is this significant? Okay, so they find it and they point it out, and they will go back to Daniel and use some of the stuff from Daniel to help them interpret Revelation, because they recognize there is a link there, but they don't draw out the entire picture like what I just did and say, look here, this is a complete unit, you know, that we need to maybe consider. So I'll give you another example, just for, about not about illusions, but about genre. So so there's a commentator, Greg Beale, a very good commentator, and he's written probably the most widely used non-dispensational commentary. And it's like 2,000 pages. It's gigantic, really small print. And he's done a lot of great detailed work. He is coming from an idealist point of view. So he's amillennial. He is not preterist. He is not dispensationalist. He's not a futurist. He's saying, so his interpretation schema is not the same as mine, and that's okay. So when he goes through the beginning of his commentary, he talks about what genre or genres is the Revelation. He says, well, it's a letter, and it's a prophecy, and it's apocalyptic. He says a lot of the same things I did, but he never draws the conclusion that because it's a letter, it must have been understandable to the first century audience. He doesn't even make any comment about it. It doesn't even come up. Okay. So, and I think what's happening there is he's not being dishonest. And on the other hand, to say it a different way, I don't think I'm stretching when I ask that question. But I think what happens is we have, not just him, not just Greg Beale, but me, we have an interpretive framework that we're working with. And we believe, each of us, you know, including you and Mike and everybody, we have some ideas in our head that we think the Revelation is about, and some other ones that we think it's definitely not about. And so when we read it, we necessarily exclude some possibilities from how we can understand this text. Like, I'll just tell you up front, there is no way, absolutely no way, that I can read the Revelation and come up with an interpretation that says those are helicopters and that is a nuclear bomb. Okay, it's not possible. I won't be able to do it. I can't see it. I just can't see it. Other people can see it. I can't. And is it because I'm being dishonest? No, it's just because I have an interpretive framework that I'm using. And so Greg Beale's framework is different than mine. He's basically, you could say it like this. And I think this is true of everyone. We have, I guess you could say it, yeah. So the way I would say it is like this, with qualifications. I want the Revelation to be directed to the first century audience, and to be about the fall of Jerusalem. And so when I read it, I unconsciously look for things that will support that, and unconsciously screen out things that won't. And that's just the way people are. It's not dishonest. It's just the way we are. And so it's really helpful to know that, it's really helpful to know that about yourself, so that when you see somebody else doing it and they come to a different conclusion, it's not because they're ignoring the evidence. It's because they can't see what I think is evidence. They can't see it. And
So just to
yeah,
kind of expand on this, your point of view, which is kind of new to me, it's very new to me. What is there any like mainline churches that view it the same as you do, or is this?
yeah, yeah. No, this isn't a weird anomaly. It's
Yeah,
so yeah, so only the Calvary chapels have a
that's
when
the
you
one
ask
I
about
know most.
when you talk about a mainline church and you say, well, what's the eschatology of the Calvary chapels? Okay, it's always going to be dispensationalists, right? I mean, maybe not always in the future, but right now, when you go to a dispensational or a Calvary chapel, they're dispensationalists. They're all futurists, and that's because they're following Chuck Smith and his eschatology, and that's how they're founded. And they don't really think there's any other eschatology that's worth looking into. But when you ask about other denominations, like what's the eschatology of the Methodist Church? Well, okay, so in the Methodist Church, you've got amillennialists, premillennialists, dispensationalists, preterists. You've got they're all over the place
Everything.
because there isn't there's no emphasis from the Methodist hierarchy that says this is our identity, right? In the Reformed Church, probably more than 50% of the people that go to Reformed churches are idealist, but probably the next group in the Reformed Church are preterists. And it could be like 30% of all of the, and there's probably very few futurists in the Reformed Church, probably no dispensational. Well, that's probably too strong. Probably less than 5% dispensationalists. And so basically preterists are found in every denomination to some degree, some percentage. They're usually not, they're usually not above 50% and probably closer to 20 to 30% in most of the denominations where they're found, except they're not in the Calvary chapels. Okay, there are no Calvary chapels that are preterist. There are no Calvary chapels that are idealist. And then preterism, or a preterist viewpoint, has been, you can go back and you can read, commentaries and etc. going all the way back to the 2nd century, and you can see that there were some or many people who were preterist in their viewpoint, and that's been true all throughout church history. But you can also go back and see that there were futurists. You can only go back 200 years for dispensationalism, but you can go back all the way to the 2nd century for historic premillennialism, and you can go back to probably the 4th century for idealism. And so it's not like it's a new thing or it's kind of obscure. It's just that it's different from the from the predominant view in America right now. And there's another view, historicism, which is almost disappeared now. It's probably like in the 1 or 2% of all the people who have an eschatology are historicists. But that historicism used to be what was known as the Protestant interpretation. It was almost universally all Protestants were historicists. But now, 400, 500 years later, that's changed. But anyway, yeah, so to summarize, the answer to your question is that there isn't any denomination that says we're preterists, but there's no denomination that says we're idealist or etc. Only the dispensationalists have done that, and only with the Calvary chapels. And but there are currently now, and there probably have been since at least the 2nd century, people who were preterists in all branches of Christianity. And but that's not to say that it was ever the most popular. It was at sometimes. Things have, the views become popular and then views become less popular, and it kind of goes in a kind of a cycle type of thing. And that's not really a great judge of what's true. Obviously, everybody once was a historicist, and I don't think any one of us thinks that's right. But um, so, but the main thing to remember, I think, when looking at the various interpretations of the revelation and how to approach it, are, sincere people are looking at the text of the revelation and the text of the Bible, and all people looking at it are coming to the text from a different perspective and with a different expectations, right? And different things that they already think the text says, and so they think the text supports that, and so they're unconsciously looking for those things, right? And so it's really good, actually, to spend some time trying to understand how each of the views come to their views, so that you can kind of sit in that seat and look at the Book of Revelation as a futurist and go, okay, I'm looking at it as a futurist, and yeah, it makes sense to me, or it doesn't make sense to me, or one of the things that I think I might have mentioned before is that all the interpretations, all the systems end up still with some problems. There's always something that you cannot explain from within the system. Whether it's an apparent problem or a real problem is unknown, but there's always problems. And so one of the strategies, or at least the strategy I use when I'm trying to resolve a situation where all the views have problems, is I think about it as leaky boats. Every system is a leaky boat, and I want to get into the one that has the least serious leaks, and maybe the one that has the least leaks, or the leaks that are not so big. And so it becomes an evaluation of not only the strong points, but what are the things that might sink this boat. And I think some views are like in a rowboat, and they've got a cannon shot through the bottom of the boat, and they might only have one hole, but that hole is so big that boat's going to sink. And so I don't want to get in that boat. But some of the things are, some of the challenges are relatively insignificant to some of the views, and they're just tiny holes. And it's like, well, that's not right, not going to sink the boat unless there's 100 of them, and then maybe that's a problem. So does that make sense?
Yeah, it totally makes sense. And then my mind's just thinking, is it possible that you can kind of take from all of these as you're moving along? But it seems like the futurist, yours pretty much eliminates that.
Right.
And what's so common right now is, like, you hear people like, well, if it gets real bad, God's just coming and taking us away, so don't worry about it, kind of thing. Whereas your view wouldn't have that.
Right.
So it completely changes your reaction to what you do with the revelations. And I like it, actually, because it seems more realistic to me. You don't know what the future is going to bring, and it's probably going to be a hardship, obvious. We're heading into more, but it's not going to be where, we're going to get left behind scenario or anything like that. When you're using your point of view.
Right.
But
yeah.
So
Go ahead.
I'm not sure what to do with all this, but it's just it's
you're just kind of stepping into the getting your toes wet, and so there's and all I'm trying to do is kind of orient you. I'm showing you what makes sense to me, but I can also represent the dispensationalists, and I think I can do it fairly, without bias, and show you why they come to their view, and I can do it with idealists and whatnot. But ultimately, at the end of the day, the dispensational approach doesn't actually make sense to me. I mean, I can understand it as a system, but as something that I think is ultimately justifiable, I don't think it is. And the same thing with idealism for the most part. I mean, there are some systems that I think are more justifiable than others. That goes back to the leaky boat thing. But as to your question about kind of an eclectic approach, right? What about just taking good things and avoiding bad things from all these systems? Mm-hmm. And there are interpreters. I think actually Greg Beale, even though he is an idealist, he says he's an eclectic interpreter, right? Mm-hmm. And what he means by that is that he says, well, the preterists say that this had relevance for the first century audience, and I think that's right, he says. And the futurist says that there's still stuff in stuff in the book of Revelation that is for us. And I think that's right. And the idealist says that what's being portrayed in the visions is that not particular events, but ideals, principles by which God works out his plan of redemption in history. And I think that's right. And the historicist says that some of these things can be tied to some historical events that have happened. And I think that's right. And so I'm going to approach the book, but it really, it's his view, even though he says all of that, is standard idealism. He basically says, he doesn't actually do any historicism, and he doesn't really bring any futurism, because when he says, well, things like the second coming, and so this is how he does it. He goes, all of the visions are about events, or not about events. All of the visions are about exemplifying principles, etc., by which God works, except for, this is what Greg Beale says, except for consummation visions. And consummation visions are visions that are about the second coming, about the raising of the dead at the end of history, about the final judgment, so consummation events. And so he says there are consummation visions in the book of Revelation, visions about what I just said, and that those are not exemplifying principles. Those are actually pointing to an actual event or events that are going to happen. And when he explains his eclectic view, he says basically that's a futurist view, but it's not. That's actually part of the preterist view. That's part of the standard idealist view. That's because preterists are not saying that everything in the Revelation is fulfilled. Preterists are saying that there was a big event coming in the first century that most of these visions are about, but of course the final judgment that Revelation talked about has not happened yet, and things like that. So we look at it and go, there's consummation visions. Greg Beale would find consummation visions. He'd find more of them in the Revelation than a standard preterist. But it's his way of understanding the Revelation is a basic standard idealism, because idealists don't say everything is about an ideal. They say that most of it is, and that some of it is about the second coming. And so, all groups agree about that. Some of it is about the second coming, but which parts? What parts and how much of the Revelation? What's the main emphasis? So dispensationalists start with the entire book is about the second coming, and the events leading up to it. And preterists basically say, well, no, I think actually most of the book isn't about the second coming, even though the second coming plays a prominent role. It is the climax of all things, and it is in the book, but it isn't the main emphasis, except by ways of encouraging the Christians to look forward to it. But, just like the New Testament letters do, exactly the same position as all the New Testament letters. So, so so anyway, what I've gone over, so far with the genre and these literary links, to me, because, I think I mentioned in maybe the first meeting, one of the things I've always been interested in is how to communicate. How does God communicate? How do you communicate stuff in literature? These things are really important to me, because I think things are being communicated. What's the genre, and what are the literary clues and markers? And so when I see them, I kind of gravitate toward them. When I'm reading, I'm kind of looking for them. And so I haven't come across one yet that would indicate that the book isn't for a first century audience. But again, that's because I probably have blinders on. That could be because of that. So that's why it's good, at least for me, to read commentators by people I disagree with, so that maybe they can show me something I haven't seen. And
it does. It's more of a palatable in some ways to do the futurist point of view, because it gives you this peace of mind that you don't necessarily have with yours. You know what I'm saying? At least for me right now. Right. I mean, we just got to go further, but I got this prejudice. I kind of like the futurist point of view of stuff because I've always sort of had that in my head.
Yeah.
So anyway, so as we go along, I have these walls I got to work with as we're doing this. This is opening my eyes quite a bit, actually. So it's pretty. I'm glad we're doing it.
Stuff to think about, and ultimately you might decide that some of it or all of it doesn't really explain the revelation as well as some other view, and that's totally fine, but it's good to, I think it's good to be exposed to more than one view, so that you
I
can,
agree.
yeah. So let me show you one more literary thing. If on the outline, on the handout, if you go to the very bottom, page 6, very last footnote.
I don't have that.
Oh,
Let's
okay.
see.
Well, that's not a problem.
Find it. Yeah.
Yeah, well, you can also just look up Revelation 22:10 and Daniel 12:4. So Revelation 22:10, Daniel 12:4. So Revelation 22:10 was the end bracket for one of the inclusios from Revelation 1 to 22. And but Revelation 22:10 also refers to, there's an allusion there to Daniel 12:4. So Revelation 22:10, if you have it there, it says, and he said to
I
me,
have it in message. Let me change this real quick
okay,
because it doesn't. It
'cause the
blurs them
message-
all together.
yeah, the message is less literal.
You said Revelation 22:10 and Daniel 12:4.
Yeah. So let me know when you guys are there.
Yeah, I have them both up on Bible Gateway.
Okay. Got him, John?
No, I'm trying to do the parallel thing and it's not coming up. I'm on the.
You're on the
So I'm
phone?
gonna get it over here.
Yeah, no
So I'm
problem.
I'll do the Daniel here.
It's going to do the old-fashioned one. Yeah,
Which is, I'm not the quickest.
that's okay.
Where is Daniel here?
So this one's really interesting. When you get to the Daniel one, let me know, John, and I'll go ahead and
Okay.
read the Revelation one when you have the Daniel one, and you can look at the Daniel one and tell me what you think.
Any minute. Daniel, show up. Where am I taking someone? There we go. And what was the
12:4.
Daniel what again? I'm sorry.
Daniel 12:4.
Oh, you guys froze.
Oh. How about now?
Oh, 4. Okay.
Are we still frozen?
Okay.
I'm seeing both of you guys fine.
Yep, I'm there.
All right. So I'm going to read Revelation 22:10. Go ahead and follow along. Daniel.
I'm hearing your voice, but you're not moving. So, but you're talking kind of slow.
Oh, Mike, can you read Revelation
Now
22:10?
you messed up.
Okay. Revelation 22:10. And he said to me, do not seal up the words of the prophecy of this book, for the time is near.
So now ask John what the comparison is.
So John, what's and I'm seeing John is, oh no, I guess he's moving. John, do you see the comparison to Daniel 12:4?
And Daniel 12:4. Daniel closed up and sealed the words of the scroll until the time of the end. Many will go here and there to increase the knowledge. Do not seal up the words of the prophecy of the scroll because the time is near. They changed it to time is near.
Right. They also changed it to do not seal from seal.
Yeah.
Can you hear me okay now?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
so in Daniel was told, shut up the words and seal the book until the time of the end. the thinking there is that Daniel's given a revelation that is not relevant to his particular time period, that it's about something that's going to happen later. And so he's told to seal it, to seal it up, because it's for a later time of the end. But John is given a revelation, and he's told, do not seal up the words of the prophecy of this book. And so there's an allusion there to Daniel 12:4, but it's the opposite, right? It's don't seal it up, which would indicate that it's not for the time of the end. It's not for some time far away. And then it explicitly says, for the time is near, right? So what you have, and this again it's coming in Revelation 22 at the end of the book, and it's and Revelation 22:10 forms an inclusio with Revelation 1:3. So you have beginning and end. Time is near. Words of the prophecy of this book, etc. John is told, don't seal it up, and Daniel is told, do seal it up. Now, if you talk about Daniel, so Daniel's writing. Where is Daniel? He's 600 BC. The things that are closest in time to Daniel that happen are things in the next empire, the Persian Empire. They're talking 150 years, 200 years. The things that mostly Daniel is about happened in the time of Christ. So you're talking 600 years. Okay. That's a long time, 600 years, seal it up. Maybe even 150 years is a long time, but let's just go with 600 years, just for the sake of argument. So John is told, don't seal it up because the time is near. Then there's the link to Daniel 12. The obvious inference is that whatever John's talking about is going to happen sometime before 600 years is over. Probably closer.
Yeah.
So, and I think, and everybody notices that inclusio. What they do with it is, everybody tries to fit it in their system. I think it naturally fits in. I think the natural fit is preterist. I don't think it fits well with futurist. I don't see how that's even
I think
possible.
one of their arguments is that these times could happen at any time, but things prevent it. Either a reawakening or something like that. But the time is near because it could happen anytime, but it doesn't because of God's work in the world. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I totally do. I've read lots of things like that. And so maybe next week we'll talk about the time language in the Revelation, soon and near and at hand, and how the different interpretive. And we'll talk about how the different systems understand those. And because you have to have some understanding. You can't just avoid it. I mean, 10 times in the Revelation it says things are soon and near and at hand. It's not like it's just once. So
I think you're right on. I mean, you're making a really good case here. So
yeah, but the first one to speak
just changing everything for me.
Yeah. It may turn out that that the proverb is true, right? The first one to present his case always sounds like he's all together until someone else gets up. And, So, Mike, you got any thoughts?
I guess not. Other than the inclusio there is, I see that a little more clearly how you're pointing it out. And this one is interesting in that it's, a very small inclusio in Daniel, and then it's expanded out into the whole book of Revelation. So that's an interesting one, in that you look at that inclusio in Daniel and see what's happening there, and you're kind of led to understand the whole book of Revelation as, following that model in some way. So that's just, I think it's an interesting device to look at.
Are you leaning towards Chuck's point of view on this, or just kind of curious where you're coming from?
Now, I think I'm still learning. I don't think I have a, I mean, I
Yeah.
would say I not just sort of naturally defer to Chuck's viewpoint in terms of trying to understand it. And it does seem to be the most viable, but I don't think I'm in a position to really,
Yeah, me either, of course.
really know.
Did this kind of, is this an eye opener for you though? Because I didn't see this before.
Oh yeah,
This-
yeah,
Yeah.
definitely.
Oops.
Yeah.
Sorry. There we go.
Was that
Okay.
was that an alarm that said you had to leave?
No, that was a incoming call. So I just declined it.
Yeah, I'm
So-
gonna need to leave in a minute or so.
Okay, so I wanted to show you one passage just real quick. Matthew 26:64. And this kind of is tagged on from last week when we talked about the apocalyptic, all the discourse and the language about coming, Christ coming. And this is tied into what we just talked about if that inclusio in Daniel, if the significance of that is that the meaning of Revelation, or at least a thrust or main theme of Revelation, is the coming in of the kingdom and the expansion of the gospel and all of that. Then this passage is related to all those themes. So Matthew 26:64, Jesus says to the high priest, who's asked him, are you the Christ? He says, you have said so, but I tell you, from now on, you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven. Now, this is an interesting passage because he says to the high priest, you, right, from now on, you. And this is you will see the Son of Man coming on clouds, seated, at the power, right hand of power, and coming on clouds of heaven. If that means the high priest is going to see the second coming, which will happen starting then and continuing forever, that he's going to see the second coming, then it's nonsense, right? It's nonsense. If it means that the high priest is going to see the second coming of Jesus, well, then it's a lie. It's just not true. But if it means that the high priest will see the result of the Son of Man being seated in the heavenly throne and coming with clouds of glory in judgment, which is the association from Daniel 7, Christ comes to the throne room for judgment. And if this is about coming, if you're going to live to see the Son of Man display his power in judgment, because he is seated at the right hand of the throne, and he has received the kingdom of his Father, and he's going to destroy the kingdoms of this world, then the high priest, he lives to see the fall of Jerusalem. So there's passages like this that really fit, I think, into a kind of the paradigm that I've been explaining that don't really fit so comfortably anywhere else. And I mean, from now on, you, the high priest, and what happens in other views, like in a futurist view, it's kind of skipped over the details, right? And that's one of the things that's really ironic about a dispensational futurist view, is that their claim is they read the Bible literally. But there is no way to read this text literally and come out with a futurist interpretation. And so they don't read it literally. They just kind of skip right over it. So, and again, it's not being dishonest. It's just because we look for things that confirm our view. And it's just natural. So that's why it's the multitude of counselors. That's where wisdom is, not because they're all saying the same thing, but because they're saying different things. So anyway, I thought that text is really helpful.
Yeah.
What is the on the clouds of heaven? That's what does that mean again? I know we went over it.
Yeah. So
That's
Yeah, so it comes from Daniel 7. It's also mentioned in Psalm 104, but Daniel 7 talks about the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven to the Ancient of Days, where he is presented before the Ancient of Days, and he receives a kingdom and power and authority and dominion which shall never end. And then in the context of Daniel 7, then the kingdoms of the beasts, the four beasts, are all destroyed, and the saints inherit the kingdom. So Daniel 7 is about the coming in of the kingdom, because the Messiah has received all power and authority in heaven and on earth. And the coming with the clouds, that's always associated with God, deity. In the Exodus, God comes with a cloud, and in Isaiah 19, he comes with a cloud.
In the atmosphere or whatever.
Yeah, well, it's not a locale, it's not a location thing. It's just an association that God, when you say comes with clouds, it means deity.
From the heavens.
You're God, right? And actually in the Daniel passage, he's not coming from the heavens, but he's going up to the heavenly. Okay, see you, Mike. But he's going up to the heavenly courtroom. So when the Son of Man comes with clouds in Daniel, which is the reference for every time Jesus talks about the Son of Man coming with clouds, there's no other reference. It's always Daniel 7. He is not coming to earth. He is going to heaven. And he goes to heaven, into the heavenly courtroom in Daniel 7 to be judged. And he is judged to have carried out his work. And so he is then rewarded by the Father giving him a kingdom. And so the shorthand for understanding coming with clouds is coming into my kingdom. It will be coming into my kingdom, meaning not I'm entering the geographical place, but that I am receiving the authority and will exercise my authority. And that's what he says. He says to the high priest, you're going to see the Son of Man coming with the power of God, because I'm exercising my authority as the universal king. And yeah, so look at, spend some time in the Daniel 7 passage. It's around verses 13 and 14, but take a look at that. Think about that.
Okay.
So
I will definitely do that. This is changing my point of view. Now, I was never real firm on any of it, because I always, like I said, every time I read Revelations, I don't get much out of it. And it's probably partly because I didn't want to focus on it. I wanted to focus on just being a good guy and hearing what God wants me to do type thing. But anyway, it seemed like this is a good time to be studying Revelations.
It does. All right.
Yeah. Anyway,
I'm
thank you so much for doing this.
Oh, you're welcome. Let me stop the recording.